thank you so much for coming. This is the second of our joint webinars between Planning Democracy and APRS. It was fantastic having an external speaker last time, but this is a chance, I suppose, for us in the movement to be speaking to each other, learn from each other, and we're hoping there'll be lots of questions. We're aware that we don't have all the answers because, of course, NPF4 is very new. However, I did email the Office of the Chief Planner this afternoon to ask whether somebody there would be willing to answer any outstanding questions that we have. So we're going to be making a list of extra questions that perhaps we can't answer, or additional things we'll be passing them on. First of all, I'd like to introduce the folk on the call, because there's a few of them. I think we've got a picture of that, yes. So the panel, Nikki, Sinclair and Clare Symonds, so you'll see them, you'll recognise them, and a few people that keep popping up. There's Kat Jones, oh, she's in a hat this afternoon, it's really quite chilly. Barry Snedden, who will be putting stuff in the chat, perhaps putting a few posts and answering any questions that you've got about the technical stuff online. So if you've got any questions, just put them in the chat and Barry can try and help you with them. He's also wearing a hat. Nina, who has set up this meeting, and you'll have had an email from her. And then Sarah is going to be fielding some of the questions that come in on the chat. So you can either ask questions on the chat through the talks going on, or there'll be a chance at the end for people to raise their hands or wave at the screen. We'll try and spot you and bring you in. We also hope people might be able to share a bit of their own wisdom if they've got it on any of the questions. If we can't answer them, there might be people who know. The next thing I need to tell you is a little bit about APRS. So there will be a break halfway through, so people can have a comfort break, get a drink of water or whatever. But I will introduce APRS. Barry is going to put a little link in to make donations. We had a couple of members last time, and I know that APRS and Planning Democracy both have members. So please do think about joining us if you support what we do, or making us a donation. So APRS is a few pictures of us doing some activities. We worked campaigning on the countryside, and our specific sort of area in planning is really concentrating on the green belts. It's something that Nikki specialises in. She's only one day a week, but she gets an awful lot done. So Nikki is our sort of fount of all knowledge. She's been a very understanding teacher for me as I've been stepping out in my first steps in planning. And she's very, very useful to the members of the Green Belt Alliance, which is a group that she sends regular newsletters around to, and are all working on planning issues in the green belts. I'm going to hand over to Claire to introduce Planning Democracy now, and then to take us forward to the rest of the evening.
Thanks, Kat. So yes, introduce myself. I'm Clare Symonds from Planning Democracy. Recognise many of you, and it's great to see so many people here today. So as a number of you will know, but some of you may not, we are a grassroots organisation. We campaign with communities who, Kat was saying we have members, but we are sort of a big network of communities all working together to make the planning system fairer and more inclusive and better at delivering sustainable developments. We give communities advice, we support people as much as we can to understand planning, and we do a lot of pretty relentless advocacy on your behalf. We often find ourselves the only community, or indeed the only environmental voice in planning meetings or workshops, policy workshops and so on, where often developers and planners dominate. But over the years, we've gained recognition and we've achieved some successes, and National Planning Framework 4 is possibly one of those. So, yeah, these are some of the links to our organisation. So we'll put those up in the break, perhaps, some of the emails. Okay, so on to tonight's session. So the aim of tonight's session is to really give you an overall view of National Planning Framework 4, what's good and what's less good in it, but also importantly, we want to explore if it will deliver better developments. So we're going to talk a little bit about monitoring its performance, and we're going to ask if you will help us to keep an eye on what it is delivering on the ground. So National Planning Framework 4 is, let's say, an invigorated planning document. It came into force in February this year, February the 13th. It's a 10-year plan, but it projects forward to 2045, which is when Scotland is expected to become a zero nation, a net zero nation. So it fits in with the ambitions of the climate change plan. It incorporates all of Scotland's planning policies, which used to be separate, but now they're incorporated into this one document. It has 33 national planning policies, which range from climate to biodiversity to rural development, aquaculture, all sorts. And Nikki will be going through some of the main ones later. These are centrally set government policies, which have to be taken into account in the local development plans. So the aim of this more top-down centralised approach to planning was really to provide some consistency of policies across the country. But there will be nuances and possibly some challenges when the new development plans, when the new local development plans are starting to be drawn up. But we don't know how it will feed down towards those local development plans just yet. So in Scotland, we have a so-called plan-led system. And this means that planning decisions have to be made according to the statutory development plan, unless there are material considerations that decide otherwise. So together, the local development plan and the National Planning Framework 4 make up the statutory development plan, which is really another way of saying that these are the two plans that will influence planning decisions the most. Now, in previous years, national planning frameworks were not part of this statutory development plan. But now that it is, it's given it greater weight and authority in planning terms, along with the local development plan. But the reason I say that we have a so-called plan-led system is that we also have what is known as a discretionary planning system. And this emphasises the role of the decision-making in using their professional judgment to take account of the various factors involved. So although the statutory development plan sets out guidance for decisions, there's also lots of room for interpretation. And planners and local councillors are often left to make their own judgments. And that policies inevitably conflict or pull against in opposite directions. And so, you know, it's up to them to make the judgment call as to which ones they want to prioritise. So, for example, a development plan may contain policies that support upgrading existing tourism facilities, while other policies may prohibit development in an area of great landscape value, where it will cause harm to the character of the landscape. So the officer would have to decide whether, say, extending a caravan development, which impacts on the landscape, is allowed or not. In fact, that was a real case that was taken to court about a caravan site in a landscape area in England, in fact. And it was argued that the policies had to be considered in the round, and that the landscape policy alone wouldn't stop the development. And I think that's a key concept to understand with regard to National Planning Framework 4. And I think Nikki will go into that a little bit more as well. So planners have to establish whether or not proposals accord with the development plan. And if there is a breach of only one policy in the development plan, a proposed development can still be said to be in accordance with the plan overall. So every planning authority in Scotland should have a new style local development plan in place by about early 2028. Now, many local authorities have already started to produce their new plans, and this is a process that takes 3 to 4 years. So some, like Edinburgh, started before the National Planning Framework 4 was approved and adopted. So they are very close to adopting their new LDP. But this is largely the exception, and most local authorities have yet to start or are just starting. So these new local development plans should take into account NPF4 and its policies, but it's acknowledged that there may be incompatibilities between LDPs and NPF4, And these are going to become apparent as these plans are produced. We don't know how that's going to quite pan out just yet. But until the new style LDP has been adopted, the old LDP will continue to be part of the development plan. And all the land allocations and policies in that plan will still be maintained. But the legislation states that in the event of any incompatibility between national planning framework and a local development plan, whichever plan is later in date is the one that will prevail. So this means that currently National Planning Framework 4 being the most recently adopted, the policies in that mostly apply to all decisions at the moment. So I did a blog quite recently, and APRS have done some guides on engaging with your local development plans. So we will send you the links to that. Barry might be putting them in the chat, I don't know, but we will definitely send you the links. As with everything we send tonight, we will be sending you everything, so you don't even need to make any notes because you'll get a recording of this as well. So also, Sarah, could we just pop back the supplementary planning guidance? That gives detailed guidance and expands upon existing policies and proposals contained in the local development plan. For example, detailed guidance on affordable housing. But from 2025, there will be no further statutory supplementary planning guidance being produced because the 2019 legislation got rid of it. Again, that was about streamlining and downsizing the planning system, if you like. Unfortunately, losing some detail in the process. So the exciting bit about NPF4 is that it has potential to be a game changer in terms of environmental protection. In 2019, there was new planning legislation, the Planning Act 2019, which many of you helped us to influence. You can give us a thumbs up, perhaps, if you did, or indeed if you helped us to influence NPF4 as well. That Planning Act 2019 gave NPF4 its enhanced status, and it also created a new legal requirement to achieve key outcomes, which you can see on this slide. So these include meeting targets for emissions of greenhouse gases and securing positive effects for biodiversity, as well as meeting housing needs. And this is quite important, that this is now statutory outcomes when it comes to monitoring, and we'll talk more about that later. I'm going to hand over to Nikki now, who's going to tell you a bit more about the NPF4 in detail.
Thanks, Claire. Yes, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what's actually in NPF4. You can see there's 3 parts to it. The first one is the spatial strategy. The Scottish Government, though, has frequently stated that NPF4 must be read as a whole. So although we tend to think the policy section feels like the crucial bits in terms of making decisions on applications and appeals, the rest of it could be influential too, both on decisions and the way development planning is done. So the spatial strategy, this sets out a national strategy of what should go where for the period up to 2045. There's a national overview and then regional strategies. Both are shown as maps, like this one, the national one, and then described in a written commentary too. A key difference here from NPF3 that preceded it is that right from the start, the strategy emphasises the key challenges we face, climate and nature particularly, whereas NPF3 set out its stall in an introduction that said it was the spatial expression of the government economic strategy, and its main focus was increasing sustainable economic growth. And that's not to say that economic growth has disappeared off the agenda. Well, NPF3 mentioned economics 41 times, NPF4 still mentions it 61 times, but the context reads quite differently. NPF3 mentions it mostly in isolation or occasionally references economic and social benefits, whereas NPF4 seems more frequently to include it with social and environmental benefits, or talking about community well-being or a greener economy. So that tone is carried through all parts of the document. The spatial strategy introduces 3 themes based around UN Sustainable Development Goals: sustainable places, with an emphasis on reducing emissions and restoring biodiversity; livable places, living better, healthier lives; and productive places, about greener, fairer, and a more inclusive well-being economy. It also introduces spatial principles, and it specifically says these principles will influence all our plans and decisions. So possibly these are worth bearing in mind too. So we've got local living, compact urban growth, and other ones. The next thing that that the spatial strategy includes are the 18 national developments. So this is quite a varied list of big projects. Being a national development means that the need for them is supposedly recognised in principle, but they still have to go through normal planning processes. So it's not always clear what difference the status really makes. Some from NPF4 didn't happen. Depends on funding and planning decisions, and sometimes how technology develops in the interim. But the 18 listed here were selected from projects that were submitted to government during the development of NPF4. The next section, second section of NPF4, at the policy areas. These are split into chunks, again, based on the 3 themes carried forward from the spatial strategy, so sustainable, livable, productive places. We're going to talk a little bit about the content of some of the policies in a bit, but this is just to explain how each one is laid out. There's the title, then what's termed policy principles, which are separated into intent and outcomes, separate section that gives instructions for LDPs, and then the actual policy for each topic. The policy sets out what sort of development will be supported and in what circumstances, and sometimes gives expectations or measures that would be required for support to be given. So it's written in a slightly different style from the previous SPP. Each policy section is doing quite a lot, setting out intention and outcome. So there are certainly some things there that could perhaps, or should perhaps, be monitored to see if a policy is delivering. And the instructions for LDPs in some ways provide the link between the 2 parts of the new development plan. And I think Barry has put links in the chat already about LDPs, but there's more information on the APRS website if anybody's interested. And the third part of NPF4 is the annexes. They're pretty self-explanatory, but I think it's worth mentioning Annex D, which is the 6 qualities of successful places. The 6 qualities are healthy, pleasant, connected, distinctive, sustainable, and adaptable. And the annex goes on into more detail about all of those. They're also referred to in some of the policies, and they link to the place standard tool, which some of you will have heard of, used by planners in trying to deliver more successful places. And it's part of the place-based thinking that supposedly supports NPF4. And then the other annex I wanted to mention was the minimum all tenure housing land requirement. Some of you will be aware that for several years, both Planning Democracy and APRS campaigned about the unfairness of how the previous planning policy dealt with land for new houses and the importance put upon certain housing land figures in terms of decision making, despite those figures being disputed and contentious. And how that planning loophole was used by developers and the impact that had on lots of communities was a real concern. It used to play out in applications and appeals and in court challenges over speculative housing on unallocated, usually greenfield sites. So the Scottish Government has acted to change that, and the Matla is part of that change. These are centrally set housing land targets for each area of the country, and there's an expectation that each local authority will allocate more land than required by the MATLA for new housing in its next LDP. That's why it's termed a minimum. However, other policy changes in NPF4 mean that the focus should then be on delivering new homes on allocated sites in a plan-led process, which should be better for planning both infrastructure and services alongside housing and delivering more livable and sustainable neighbourhoods. It's not a perfect solution. The MATLA is not a minimum in terms of the number of dwellings needed to meet housing need. The figures are increased up from that, sometimes quite significantly and for a variety of reasons. So as an example, this is how the MATLA for Midlothian was arrived at. It's by a process conducted by Scottish Government, but with local authority input, based on 10-year projections for households, plus local authority estimates of housing need. Added to that is what is called generosity or sometimes flexibility allowance, by which 25% or 30% in urban areas is added to allow for the likely difficulty of being able to build houses on some of the allocated sites in the timescale for whatever reason. So quite significantly uplifted from what you might think was the minimum. Despite setting these figures centrally, there's still some concerns about volume house builders lobbying local authorities, encouraging them to increase the amount of land they allocate for new housing beyond what is required, and then that would potentially decrease the impact of some of the other NPF4 policies aimed at making new housing more sustainable and creating neighbourhoods that allow people to live lower carbon lifestyles. So back to those spatial principles of local living and compact urban growth, perhaps. The paper that this quote from Midlothian comes from is a position update on Midlothian's new LDP, for which the evidence report is about to be drafted. And it explains the dilemma the local authority faces in having to decide on a figure for housing land allocations. I think Barry was going to put a link to the paper in the chat if any housing nerds want to have a look. But perhaps unsurprisingly, it notes that the feedback from the volume house building industry that Midlothian has had on this so far is that the housing land allocation in the new LDP should be considerably higher than the MATLA figure. So on that note, I'm going to hand back to Claire.
Okay, well, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of some of the positives and negatives of NPF4 before we have a short break for you to reinvigorate your brains. So as you can see, I've been inspired by the spaghetti westerns, so you'll probably realise where this is going. National Planning Framework 4 is a really progressive document compared to what's gone before. As Nikki was saying, you know, climate and biodiversity are right up there, with significant weight being given to them in all decisions. Significant weight. So there is an emphasis on biodiversity enhancement as well as protection. NPF3 did not mention the climate crisis or the biodiversity crisis at all. They talked more about climate in terms of delivering a low carbon economy, and biodiversity is only mentioned 11 times, where it's mentioned 96 times in NPF4. So you can see that the document sets out the climate and biodiversity crisis as being two interlinked crises and key priorities needing to be addressed. There's also good policies on ancient woodland and trees, and some new policies on soils, which could be very important. And as Nikki was explaining, it sets out a very different policy context for land for new housing, and removing some of those loopholes that allowed for exceptional releases for housing developments, all too often on greenbelt or greenfield sites. So it's tightened up on those. So technically that leaves less room for challenge, by the volume house builders, which leads to the endless appeals and court challenges, usually over contentious ways of calculating housing figures. Although the developers are still at it, as Nikki will explain in later slides. But there's lots of other reasonable policies to protecting green belts and greenfield sites as well. So lots of good stuff in there. The less good stuff, the bad stuff maybe, is that some policies appear to be a bit weaker than in previous position. These are ones on natural places, they are specially protected and wildland areas with regard to perhaps new renewable energy targets and landscape. This is still a bit untested, and it depends on whether it's considered significantly adverse effects on the integrity of the area, and as to whether they are outweighed by other national, social, economic or environmental benefits. But as we said, NPF4 needs to be read as a whole, so other policy might be able to influence decisions too. It will need to bed in really, but there's a lot of uncertainties at the present, which hopefully will iron out in time. And as I said, a lot will be left to decision makers to decide how much they're going to prioritise biodiversity and climate policies. So that really means a lot of you having to be vigilant and to push hard for the kind of priority interpretation that you want. There's still needing a lot of guidance to support NPF4. That's still being produced so that planners understand how to interpret these policies. There was one on biodiversity and planning that was only published last week. We'll mention that later. Emissions measurements, that's still early days. A new guidance on how to do housing land audits is not due until next year. So you can see they're still sort of feeling their own way, I think, through this and how they're going to deliver it. As we explained before, many of these policies are open to interpretation, and that leads to uncertainty. There's exceptions policies in many policies, lots of get-out clauses, mitigation clauses that water down some of the intentions. One of the many sayings attributed to Churchill, I'm sure he didn't say half as much as people claim that he says, but he said that a pessimist sees the difficulty in every opportunity, and an optimist sees the opportunity in every difficulty. So I want us to try and see if we can be optimists. This discretionary system requires consideration of different policies, but planning also requires community engagement. And this, in my mind, is our opportunity to remind planners and our elected representatives that climate and biodiversity are now the new priorities. The intention is stated, the policies are there, but as government often makes plans but doesn't always fulfill them. And just because the policy is written doesn't necessarily make it happen on the ground. It's a culture change and a mindset, and that takes more than just a written policy. And I think it's up to us to push that as much as we can. So what we're going to be asking you to do is to help us take a monitoring role on that. And we need you to alert us to what's happening on the ground to make sure these policies are working or not. And we'll explain more about that later. But sadly, that does all mean a lot of extra work for you guys. So now we get to the dirty rat, Tuco. So I think that's his name. Yes, they're ugly. So NPF4 doesn't really change the mechanics of the planning system or the wider context. It can't change everything. It can't change the way we tax our land or the business models of the volume house builders. Planning gets blamed for a lot, but we need to look at the other drivers as well. So although NPF4 states that biodiversity and climate are two key priorities, there's still the driver to achieve economic growth. I think there's a tendency for politicians to want to develop our way to net zero through an increased reliance on renewables and building carbon capture technologies, rather than considering how to limit development. For example, building all the houses in the Matla will probably blow our entire country's carbon budget, especially with the kind of mainstream private housing that we are seeing built at the moment. And there's a danger that we ignore the fact that construction and development really contributes to up to 30% of our carbon emissions. And of course, commercial pressure and lobbying will be applied wherever possible. There's still questions about who pays for the data collection, who does the surveys. There's lots of lobbying on housing numbers, as Nikki was suggesting. And, commercial interests will take every opportunity to influence land allocations. And of course, there's still huge imbalances in the system reflected in the power dynamics, where communities and the environment lack the power to appeal planning decisions, but developers are able to do so at no cost to themselves. And NPF4 sadly doesn't change that. So there's still some way to go, but still we have a little bit of hope that this is a document that we can use to press for change.
And we're going to take a quick look next at a few of the policies to summarise some of the changes in NPF4 and perhaps some of the challenges ahead. So the first policy 1, as Claire's mentioned, is really important change. The first policy is about tackling the climate and nature crises. It's intended to promote zero carbon and nature positive places. It says that significant weight will be given to both the global climate and nature crises. As Claire mentioned, it's important that they're linked, and also the fact that it says significant weight should be crucial. Mm-hmm. It also emphasises that it applies to all development proposals, which suggests that there is potential for it to be referred to in responses to all planning applications. It's a really strong direction to decision makers and those creating LDPs. But it's important that we ensure that it's being considered in every decision. I expect we're going to need to push this policy all the time. This is the only plan that we're going to have for the next, or planning framework that we're going to have for the next decade, which is pretty crucial for climate and nature. So yeah, not just for while there's a COP going on. Policy 2 gives a bit more detail about the climate side, both mitigation and adaptation. It's intended to support emissions reduction and increase resilience to climate change. It's quite nuanced in some ways, talking about siting and design to minimise life cycle emissions, and the implications of that will probably vary on the development being considered and the location in question. I suspect further guidance about how to consider life cycle emissions in different development types is probably going to be needed, and how to interpret as far as possible will probably change over time. But we've already seen this policy cited in a few local authority decisions where they have refused permission, partly based on the proposed location being likely to encourage considerable private vehicle traffic and therefore increase emissions. And it also gives good support to the retrofit of existing buildings. And policy 3 is about biodiversity. The intent here is to protect biodiversity, reverse biodiversity loss. And I saw in the chat, someone's already mentioned how we've lost so much biodiversity in Scotland already. So this policy is very much aimed at reversing that. The idea is that it will deliver positive effects from development. So LDPs are similarly instructed to protect, conserve, restore and enhance biodiversity in line with the mitigation hierarchy. So that's a new introduction. And also to create nature networks across their areas. Under Policy 3, development proposals must contribute to the enhancement of biodiversity. And for national or major developments, that requirement is spelt out a bit more, in that there needs to be a demonstrably better state than without intervention for the proposal to be supported. But as Claire's already mentioned, how will we implement this? Well, the policy says best practice assessment methods should be used, and it gives a list of criteria for major developments that need to be met, that range from understanding the site, using nature-based solutions where possible, to management arrangements for long-term retention of benefits and then monitoring them. But there is still a lot of ongoing work intended to support this policy and set out what best practice is. We're far from being there at the moment. Nature Scot have published some guidance, and just last week, as Claire mentioned, Scottish Government published planning guidance on biodiversity in draft form. Scottish Government have actually described it as a living document and are asking for feedback on it. So there's an opportunity for anyone to do that if you want to comment on it, or you feel there are developments going on that are ignoring it. Barry is hopefully putting the links in the chat. There's also ongoing work on a biodiversity metric to help with assessing enhancement. There's going to be a one designed for Scotland, or at least amending the one that's been produced for England to reflect Scotland's habitats. And also the new Scottish biodiversity strategy and the forthcoming biodiversity targets will also be relevant when they come in. So it feels like a major change is the emphasis on enhancement, not just protection. Current difficulty is how we measure this, how we know things will be better. And as we've definitely found out today, we definitely can't just leave it to planners and developers and even councillors. There's a real role for interested people in the community to help with this. And Claire will say a bit more about that in a bit. Next policy I want to mention is housing. It's called Quality Homes, Policy 16. Scottish Government intention seems to be for it to be a simpler policy, more focused on delivering the right housing in the right place, and to be more plan-led and sustainable. So you've got a picture here of sort of eco-compact urban sustainable homes, and another one. Oh, it's a different picture, actually. Sarah's changed the picture on the slide. Not what I expected, but yeah, compared with speculative £1 million homes in the Greenbelt. But, oh, Sarah, you caught me out. Anyway, the intention is for housing post NPF to be more plan-led. There's an instruction for local authorities to have a housing land pipeline, which is a new phrase, and that's to be made up of allocated land for housing delivery phased over 10 years. And that will be set out in the LDP delivery programme. The housing policy no longer has the rule where the 5-year effective housing land requirement and the failure of local authorities to meet that target could potentially trigger releases of unallocated land for speculative developments at planning appeals. I've mentioned the Matla already. There are still circumstances where there can still be releases of non-allocated land for new housing, but they're much more specific. They're set out in policy 16F, and the main thrust of this is that there could be further releases of land, of non-allocated land, if the allocated housing land in the LDP is being built out faster than expected. So it's almost the opposite of what happened before, and hopefully, again, more of a plan-led system rather than planning by appeal. However, some of you know very well that there's currently still quite a number of live appeals by volume house builders over proposed developments on non-allocated sites. And a lot of those appeals have been put on hold or sisted because of a challenge by a developer at the Court of Session over how housing policy in NPF4 works. So the results of that are expected, I think, in the new year, and we'll find out how NPF4 housing policy is being interpreted then. And then the last policy that I'm going to mention now is policy 11, energy. It gives really strong support to all forms of renewables, except for wind farms in national parks and national scenic areas. Policy 11E does give a long list of impacts that have to be addressed and mitigated. They include communities, landscape, public access, aviation, telecommunications, etc., including the cumulative impacts of all of these. But it also says, in considering these impacts, significant weight will be placed on the contribution of the proposal to renewable energy generation targets and on greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets. So really strong support for renewables. I do wonder whether, given the huge renewables targets and pace of change of technology, that there maybe needs to be a bit of an update to guidance about cumulative impacts and how they are assessed, but that's for the future at the moment. And then we wanted to give a quick flavour of a few decisions since NPF4 was adopted. Interpretation of it's developing all the time. So this is just a few examples. A couple of renewables appeals with differing results. So Shepherd's Rig, the wind farm proposal in Dumfries and Galloway. And pre-NPF4, there was a public inquiry as the local authority had objected to it. And the reporter's report in April 2022 was against allowing it, mainly due to the significant adverse landscape and visual impacts. However, because a decision hadn't been reached before the publication of the revised draft of NPF4, Scottish ministers then asked for the inquiry to be reopened to look at the implications of NPF4. And a similar thing has happened with some of the housing appeals too. The resulting supplementary report had a different finding. It recommended the consent be granted. The reporters then concluded that the proposed development now had very strong support in principle, both from national energy policy and planning policy, and its benefits, in particular, its contribution to renewable energy targets, now clearly outweighed its significant landscape and visual effects. So ministers granted consent on that basis, and NPF4 is seen as giving more support to meeting renewables targets, definitely. But do also recognise that behind that, Scottish Government energy policy and targets have also been changing. They're much higher. So in part, NPF4 is dealing with a changed context too. However, it's not to say that all wind farms and renewables will get permitted under the new regime. In June this year, Scottish ministers issued a decision following a public inquiry into a renewable energy development in Argyll and Bute, and consent was refused in this case, mainly due to the impact of the proposal on the setting of a scheduled monument, not even the fabric, just the setting. So that related to NPF4 Policy 7, which is historic assets and places. And probably it's another reminder that NPF4 needs to be read as a whole. Energy decisions are not going to be just made on the energy policy. You need to look at the whole thing. And then Moss End, I've already mentioned this case. It's Scottish ministers called in the appeal for housing in West Lothian on a greenfield site. They called it in for their decision earlier in the year because it was raising issues about how policy 16F on housing land operated. The developers made arguments at appeal about various housing figures in West Lothian that were along very similar lines to those in pre-NPF4 cases. And in effect, were saying that policy 16 couldn't operate fully because a new NPF4 compatible LDP was not yet in place. So ministers took the decision and knocked back the appeal. But the developers have then taken the Scottish ministers to court. And as I said, we're waiting to see what happens. And the the last one, biodiversity, cool links. So this is about proposed plans to build a golf course on one of Scotland's last undeveloped dune systems. Planning officers from Highland Council recommended the plans be refused. Their report's main conclusion was that the proposal cannot comply with NPF4's policy requirement to deliver biodiversity enhancement due to overall adverse impacts on the protected areas. And some of the protected areas are protected nationally and internationally. Nature Scot also objected to this. However, just today, I understand that Highland Council's planning committee approved the plans to go forward. This comes 3 years after there was an extensive public inquiry and refusal of a very similar scheme. So doesn't seem to be good news for nature or access to nature, but we'll have to wait and see if Scottish Government call the decision in, which they could because of Nature Scot's objection. We might be able to put information about that case and how people can encourage ministers to call it in if you feel they should in the chat. I think Barry might have done that too. And then I'm going to quickly hand back to Claire.
Thanks. Yes, that safe call links is in the chat if anybody wants to click the link and join the RSPB e-action to ask the Scottish ministers to call it in and have a think about the decision again. So that's something you can be doing as well. We are now, NPF4, as I said, was adopted in February. So we're now in what the Scottish Government called a delivery phase of NPF4 and making sure it's put into practice. And part of this includes making sure that planners and decision makers understand how to implement the policies. And this is, I think, particularly important with the biodiversity policies, as they're really quite new, especially the enhancement element. And it's acknowledged that planners lack the expertise in nature and ecology, and local authorities are so strapped for resources, they don't always have ecological teams and expertise available to help. So that's a problem. And there's also, as Nikki was saying, there's no single accepted methodology for calculating or measuring biodiversity enhancement. So how do we know whether or not nature is better off? So as Nikki's already said, some guidance was produced last week on how to implement policy 3 on the biodiversity enhancement aspect. And it states that developers should apply a mitigation hierarchy, which means basically preventing impacts from happening first of all, and then considering mitigation. And they should be considering biodiversity from the outset. But there's still a lot of detail to add to that guidance. It's still, as Nikki said, a living document. So if you do have expertise in biodiversity monitoring and measuring, do get in touch with the chief planner on that. We have spoken to the chief planner and also the new planning improvement champion about how we monitor these policies, particularly housing and biodiversity policies. The government said they were keeping their ear to the ground, which is possibly not the most convincing of monitoring policies. But the improvement officer, Craig McLaren, is doing some consultation around it. And if you think back to that slide that I put about the statutory outcomes and the fact that biodiversity and climate change are statutory outcomes as well as providing housing, the government previously very much focused their monitoring and planning performance frameworks around speed and efficiency, how quickly they were processing planning applications, rather than what it was delivering and whether or not it was delivering these outcomes. you know, that's one of the things that the planning improvement champion is trying to explore, is how do you measure that? And I think the more these things get measured, the more it's obvious, you know, where it's not achieving. So I think this monitoring phase is really, really important. And also planners, if they know they're being watched and you know, they're having to write reports about it, it's really important, I think, for making sure that they do actually achieve these things. And communities are often the ones who raise the concerns, you know, often about, you know, where the planning conditions are being stuck to or whatever. So I think this is a real need and an opportunity to get communities involved, and we've been really pushing that with the government and with Craig as well. You know, talking about communities doing a more citizen science approach, you know, so that you can be monitoring developments. You're there on the ground. You can see whether they're actually delivering for nature or not. So you know, it's something we're asking you to do, is to right now we really need to know you know, whether or not planning decisions are achieving it. We want to know, you know, what's happening on the ground right now. So if you could, as I said, fill in that form, we're asking for help to help us monitoring in 3 different ways. The first is to give us examples, you know, just like Nikki did with the different examples of planning applications that are going through, and whether or not they're working for biodiversity or not. So if you can do that, please tick that part of the monitoring form that we've sent, that Barry's put in the chat. And also the second thing we are really wanting is a bit more of a deep dive into a desk-based study, looking at a number of planning decisions in your local authority planning portals, and you know, a bit of a deep dive to sort of bolster some of the monitoring that the RSPB are doing as well. So that might need a little bit of training and help on how to do that. We can provide that if you tell us if you're interested. What we're trying to do is assess how much people will help us with this. And the final thing is helping us to go out monitoring biodiversity on housing development sites as they're being constructed and afterwards. This has already been done by Nature Scott. They've been looking at it prior to NPF4, but they're not actually doing it, and they've only done it on a small number of sites. So we think we could broaden that out and make it a much more citizen science approach. I think it would be something that people might quite enjoy, sort of going counting how many trees have actually made it. And whether the suds ponds are in the right place, and so on and so forth. So that's another thing that you could do. So please do let us know whether you are interested in helping us to monitor NPF4 in the future. Final slide. You know, there's a lot people can do. One of the indirect causes of biodiversity decline is our distance from nature and our lack of appreciation for it. That's what the State of Nature report says. And I think one way of getting better acquainted with nature is to start, you know, getting excited about how we can enhance these developments and so on. And there's lots of courses available, and we can send you information about them if you show an interest and indicate an interest. There are bursaries available as well. And there's lots of databases and tools that can help you find out what sort of biodiversity there is in your area already. So we can send you links to these if you fill in your monitoring forms.
Can I say thank you so much to all of you for coming along, for Barry for dealing with all the questions, for Nina for doing all the admin and getting everybody here, and for Sarah for doing the slides and keeping us kind of on track. So I'll say goodbye on behalf of everybody at Planning Democracy and APRS, and we'll see you in January. Have a very, very happy Christmas when it comes. I realise it's still a few weeks away, even though I had my Christmassy hat on, which I'll put back on again. So thank you very much all.
And fill in your feedback forms and the monitoring form, please. Thank you.